This session is really just a Q&A, a discussion. I'd love to learn from you, answer any questions you have. Because sometimes it takes a minute for questions to bubble up, I already have one on the app that I will answer. So, what sparked you and your father's passion enough to write this kind of literature? Well, how long do we have? Let's see, how far back to go? I would say a piece of this, so we're Jewish, and I think there's a piece of our background and history of our family that makes my family very attuned to injustice and very aware that if we don't do something, nobody's gonna do anything, you know? So my parents were both very active in the civil rights movement when they were younger, and I grew up with that, so it was sort of in my blood. Now, my dad's story of how he came to write The Color of Law, I will try to tell it as best I can. He was, when I was growing up, he was a union organizer, and then he started working in education policy as a researcher for the LA Unified School District. And he started becoming very interested in racial disparities, the achievement gap between black and white students. And you know, there's a lot around it being about the quality of the schools that they go to and the quality of their teachers. And through his research, he started to see, you know, the schools are very racially segregated. It has a lot to do with the achievement gap. Why are the schools racially segregated? Oh, their neighborhoods are segregated. And so he came to this sort of later in his career as an important issue to begin to research. And then from that came The Color of Law. So he wasn't a housing person before that. He's not a trained historian, but that's sort of how The Color of Law came to be. And I was working in housing, worked in affordable housing, development finance, community development, and then did some work in criminal justice reform. And after The Color of Law became such a big hit, which was a surprising hit for everyone involved, the publisher, the first run of the book printed 5,000 copies. And so just to show that, you know, nobody really knew that the country wanted to learn about this history. It's now sold over 1 million, so it has had a big impact. And I was one of the people who, after his lectures, asked him, you know, it's great that we now know about this, or we're remembering the true history of how we came to be segregated, but what do we do about it? And he, in sort of dad fashion, turned it around and said, well, why don't you help me answer it? And I brushed him off for a couple of years, I'm embarrassed to say now. But, you know, you never know if working with your dad is a good idea. So he convinced me eventually. And part of what convinced me was just the platform that he had developed through The Color of Law. It felt like a disservice to not sort of help use that platform to continue and advance the work. So that's my answer to that question.
All right, thank you.
Oh, okay. Well, I already asked the question.
Hi, thank you so much. I feel like this is a weird question. So for my master's thesis, I did some work on ethnic violence and civic engagement. And when you were talking earlier about forming biracial, multi-ethnic community groups as a way to address the segregation problem and try to desegregate, I was curious if you have any, you know, if you see any ties in other ways or how that can spread to other issues and sort of, you know, heal other harms. And then I'm also just interested in like what kind of background research you did and sort of where you pulled some of your ideas from in that regard.
I think that the like forming biracial, multi-ethnic groups and integrated neighborhoods is essential to sort of move past the polarization that we live with. Until we like see people as our neighbors and understand that they're like us and stop like othering each other. And we can't do that if we don't have contact with each other. You know, when I think it was right when the book came out this summer was when there were a few instances of African Americans being shot by white homeowners who were just like pulling into their driveway to turn around. And it was like, we don't see each other as humans because we don't live amongst each other. We have, like, to get beyond that, we just have to start to get beyond it and create communities where we share space and get to know each other. And so we can do that through creating housing that's accessible to everybody and intentionally integrating that housing. A lot of, I guess I didn't get to this earlier, but you know, a lot of the things, the strategies we talk about that lead to increasing housing supply, we then advocate for putting preferences on a lot of the housing built to ensure that those who've, you know, African Americans who've historically been excluded from housing or excluded from certain neighborhoods get priority for those units. We have to intentionally like create these integrated communities where people can live together and get to know each other. And we can start by like those kinds of groups that I mentioned where we start to do that in our neighborhoods and in our cities. And then, the kind of research that we did. I think coming into the project together, my dad and I both had a list of ideas of policies or strategies that would be useful to redress or challenge segregation. And so we started with that, just based on his research and my experience. And we started, you know, very little in Just Action is like original thought. A lot of this, like, you all are doing the work, and there's experts on every single one of these strategies. There's people who devote their whole lives, academic careers, practitioner careers on this one little piece. And we hoped this book would fill the gap that there's no one depository where you can find enough information to understand all of them without sort of going into the rabbit hole for each individual policy and trying to become an expert on each one. We tried to sort of give enough of an overview that people could understand enough to know what their community needed and how to advocate for it without needing to become an expert. So we also didn't become an expert on everything. We relied on a lot of experts because it would have taken us our whole lives to write the book, and we were really trying to get it done. So we relied on a lot of experts already working on this, and we found groups around the country implementing each strategy. And I can't say I have a good answer for how we found them, but just by word of mouth or hearing about it or reading newspaper articles, reaching out, you know, one phone call turns into 10 more phone calls, and then you find somebody who is on the ground doing the thing. And yeah, you know, I live in the Bay Area in California, and I've worked in housing there, but we're very intentional about spreading our focus all across the country to all different types of communities. So I didn't even like use personal connections that much to do the research because my dad wouldn't let me write about California. So, yeah. Yeah.
Hey, so I had 2 questions. I guess the first one is in your talk or up in the ballroom, which is great, by the way. One of the things you talked about for a while as an anti-displacement tool were land trusts, and I work for Habitat for Humanity, Seattle, King, Kittitas counties, and one of the conversations I have, on local and county level, is about public like surplus land and for affordable housing and financing and so on and so forth. And one of the things that I often kind of just sit there and think, well, why not? Is why don't essentially, what if we could create, or rather have cities create land banks of their own, right? And because for my organization, other organizations, we use land banking techniques in order to keep land affordable, as you described up there, as well as other organizations. But essentially, what would your thoughts be on cities land banking themselves? And then my second question is more of like kind of a, I guess, more abstract or more narrative question. So I apologize in advance. But one of the things that you mentioned that really resonated with me was that we needed to start a new civil rights movement. And I remember the organizing around Black Lives Matter, and within the organization Seattle King County, and and seeing the progression from that kind of mobilization that you described to now backlash against police reform, against even at the federal level addressing racial injustice, right? Seeing with the Supreme Court's affirmative action decision and so on and so forth. And the undercurrent within that is like this concept of color blindness, right? It's like, oh, we don't really need to talk about racism anymore. It just makes us feel uncomfortable and it's just divisive, right? Obviously, we all know that's rubbish. But my question to you is like, what in your mind would be a effective way to counter that narrative of color blindness in both policy conversations and really just like society-wide, the social discourse and all over society?
Okay. Okay, so the first question, was it about cities starting their own land trusts?
Yeah.
Or land banks? Land trusts.
Sorry, land banks.
Land banks.
Yeah.
So local governments often have land banks where they bank sort of properties that they've foreclosed on. And as I understand it, the issue, there has to be a process to clear the title on those properties before they can then be used for something else. So that is an important thing to do, clearing the title, because they're often either they've been abandoned homes or foreclosed on. And then, so a lot of cities have land banks, and I don't know what they're doing with that property, but they could be. Some are working on connecting their land banks. And if anybody has more information on any of these answers, because as I said, you're probably more expert at all of these nuances than I am, please help. But it's connecting those land banks with like a housing trust fund to help get those houses then back into productive use and be made affordable. So that is something that can be done. In terms of connecting them, then those homes and those land banks could be donated to a land trust, just as easily as any other vacant property in a city could be donated to a land trust. And I do think that it's important for a land trust to be a nonprofit separate entity that's not government run, because one piece of the model of the land trust model is that the board of directors is usually like a third residents of land trust homes, a third members of the community where the land trust operates, and a third professionals in like housing or real estate. So it's important to have that sort of community run organization. So does that answer that question somewhat? And then your second question, I think, what we're doing is with this book and speaking about it and promoting the ideas in it is trying to be very specific that we, need to remedy race-specific crimes with race-specific remedies. And I think to counter this sort of like, we need to be colorblind or it's too divisive to talk about race, one approach to that is basing all of these conversations and remedies and solutions in the history that was very race conscious, very race specific. And I think that's one of the reasons why the color of law has had such an impact on the country, because people didn't know, a lot of white people didn't know how explicitly these policies were created to be targeted at African Americans. And once we see that, we can start to understand and explain that a race-neutral policy isn't going to remedy a race-specific harm. You know, there's more white people than African Americans in the country, so if you create a down payment assistance for anybody, more whites are gonna get it than African Americans. If you want to create a down payment assistance program that remedies the harm to African Americans from the policies that created segregation and from housing discrimination, it has to be targeted at those who suffered the harms of that discrimination. And I think basing it in that history is a lot harder to argue with. And you know, I've done a lot of book events with my dad where people come up to us afterwards and tell him that their lives were like completely changed from reading Color of Law, and I think, or their career paths completely changed. And I think part of it is that, like, understanding how explicit and how intentional this was really changes what you think you need to do about it. So,
Hi, I have a question in follow-up to this morning on your idea of Is that better? Oh, yeah.
I can hear you.
The idea that with the Section 8 vouchers and basing them on small areas. So I work at the Housing Finance Commission. We get calls from people looking for housing. They have a voucher, it's expiring. They're looking for some place that they can qualify to move in. And, you know, a lot of times they're coming to us looking for affordable housing because other places won't accept their voucher. So I wanted to look more into the idea of if they went from the small areas so that it wasn't priced out of their voucher area. If I'm on the other side, if I'm the Public Housing Authority issuing vouchers, what have you seen? I'm assuming there's no more voucher money available if you take this version of the small areas. So what do you think the percentage of loss in the number of vouchers they have is a result if they do the small areas, and is any way to counteract that?
Well, what happens when you do the small area, so when the voucher amount is set on the median of the whole metropolitan area, it's too low for this 60%, and it's actually too high than this 40%. So it's paying a higher rent than market rent for many of the units that voucher holders are in. So when they adopt the small area rent standard, the first year, if a lot of tenants move to higher cost areas, there is a cost, and I believe that HUD reimburses that cost because they reimburse, you get your voucher allocation. And then in future years, it adjusts because as the voucher amounts in these higher cost areas go up, they go down in the lower cost areas. And so it does eventually have a sort of, I don't know if it's neutral, but close to neutral cost impact. And some housing authorities that adopt this voluntarily, they'll do it in pieces. Maybe like in this area, we'll do a small area rent standard and keep the rest the same. Part of the reason is that housing authorities, because all of these landlords in the lower income areas are getting higher than market rents from the Section 8 program, the housing authorities don't want to piss off those landlords. But if we're thinking about what's the best allocation of our public money, it's also a question that housing authorities should be grappling with. What's the importance of, it's balancing this scarce resource. If we can do a few less vouchers, but we're actually allowing for families to move out of high poverty areas when they want to, maybe that's a balance that housing authority wants to strike. And there are also comprehensive mobility programs that housing authorities and housing organizations sort of jointly implement, where they provide extra counseling and extra financial resources to voucher holders to move to high opportunity areas, and those often have philanthropic support. So there are ways to sort of make it work, and there are housing authorities that are doing it voluntarily, so it works for them. Yeah, but it's a good question, because I think someone has the mic.
Well, good morning, and thank you for joining us today. Your story is very empowering. Very similar to your father, I found the achievement gap in my early 20s and was really looking at black-white achievements, and really found it did relate to the neighborhoods they grew up in, which has to do with property taxes. And so the funding of certain schools do have significantly more funding than others, and it's currently existing in most of our cities. My question really relates a lot to when we start looking at the challenges that the Fair Housing Act prevents folks from really providing specific race-based support services and things of that nature. For instance, we have started a land trust here in Pierce County, and a lot of the struggle really is just getting folks on board and helping the local governments understanding what we're trying to do, and then trying to create a space where we can fit in, right? Because there's other nonprofits and land trusts, similar land trusts that are already there for 15 or 20 years who've been doing the work, and it's really hard to break in. So that's the first hard thing for us. But when we start looking at, we can't do like specific, housing programs for the black community because fair housing doesn't allow that. There's a lot of different policies that prevent specific support for African American community or the Hispanic Latino community. What types of policies or ideas do you suggest that we could potentially move forward with? Or, when I start thinking about the civil rights movement, a lot of folks were, they really support it, but I don't think a lot of folks really understood what had to be done. Folks had to sit at lunch tables, at restaurants where they got beat and were dragged out. They had to drink at water fountains, There was a lot of harm done to folks who had to fight against the system. And I feel like that's the next fight for affordable housing if we're talking about a civil rights movement. So I'd just like you to help maybe guide us on that a little bit.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I would counter a bit about the Fair Housing Act.
Sorry, Leah. I want to ask, follow up this because we have another question
Okay.
that would add to this. It says, is there an area in the country that is tackling the affordable housing and anti-displacement in communities of color in a creative way? Because the Fair Housing Law prohibits it, and others, what others should pay attention to.
Okay. Okay, so the Fair Housing Act is often interpreted that it it prohibits discrimination in the sale and rental of housing by race and all the other protected classes. And so often folks interpret that to mean that we can't talk about race or we can't address race when it comes to housing. Realtors use that excuse to say they can't talk about the racial makeup or integrated makeup of a neighborhood when talking about housing with their clients because of the Fair Housing Act. Now, I would argue that the Fair Housing Act requires us not to discriminate and also to affirmatively further the purposes of fair housing. And to affirmatively further the purposes of fair housing, we have to talk about race, and we have to promote integrated neighborhoods and promote integration. And so we have a chapter in Just Action about, it's called Dare to Defy, about being courageous enough to defy what many people think is an outright prohibition to talk about race or create race-specific programs. And, our sort of left-wing-ish, left-leaning deference to the Supreme Court, that if the Supreme Court is not going to agree with being race-specific, then we can never do it. And we argue that the Supreme Court has very rarely been on the side of advancing racial equality and very rarely been correct in interpreting the Constitution when it comes to racial equality. And so we shouldn't defer to what we think this activist Supreme Court will tell us we can't do. and instead do it. And if we're challenged legally, we'll defend it, and we can defend it by furthering the purposes of the Fair Housing Act, by remedying the racial harms that were caused in the past by government policy, and then build up case law, even if we're defeated, that can then be used in the future to protect these programs. So with that, I know it takes a lot of courage to do that, and hopefully collectively we could build that courage together. Washington State is doing it with its Covenant Homeownership Act. This is why I'm talking about it all over the country, because people everywhere, but we can't do anything that you're talking about because the Supreme Court just struck down affirmative action, wants us to be race blind, and we argue that that's actually not the way to, not the correct interpretation of the Constitution or the Fair Housing Act. So, given that, as we build up the courage to do that, there are workarounds that people have developed to be able to try to create integrated neighborhoods, counter segregation and housing discrimination, more try to target benefits toward African Americans and those who have suffered discrimination. So things like, first-time homebuyer programs, African Americans more likely to be first-time homebuyers than whites, still a workaround, still not a direct remedy for the harm, but that helps. First-generation homebuyer programs, again, narrowing it down a little bit. African Americans more likely to be first-generation homebuyers than whites, so it's trying to get closer to helping that group of people without being direct about what we're trying to do. So it's not the perfect solution, but it is a solution and a way around it. There's also preferences in terms of anti-displacement strategies. Some programs have preferences for households at risk of displacement or who have been displaced. So giving a preference to those people who've lived in the community for a long time when gentrification has occurred and new housing is built there, giving priority to those longtime residents or people who have been displaced in the last 5 years. So there are ways to try to target these programs and benefits a little more. Again, none of them will be as effective as being race-specific and tying those benefits to the race-specific crimes of the past, but I don't know, we should be doing all of it, I think.
And thank you for your book. I run a CDC and a nonprofit that is affordable housing in Southeast Seattle. We're actually doing a staff and board book club around your book.
Oh, great.
So excited to bring this back. We're in a neighborhood that's famously been historically racially diverse and is rapidly gentrifying part of Seattle. We do affordable apartments, mainly LIHTC. What do you think the unique responsibilities are of LIHTC developers? How do we focus our energy to repair harm that's been done?
Did everybody hear the question? How can LIHTC developers, what role can they play in these solutions? So there are a few ideas. I don't know that any of them will be new, but ensuring that we don't just only build LIHTC units in high poverty, sort of low cost, high poverty areas and bring LIHTC units to higher opportunity neighborhoods. Creating truly mixed use developments is something we talk about a lot, which I know, the mixed income developments often include market rate and LIHTC units, which is a mix, but it's not actually a true mix. We need to have those middle income units there as well for reasons of social cohesion and for reasons of creating housing opportunities for everybody who needs it. And that includes, a lot of people in the middle income category who make too much for LIHTC units and too little to afford market rate units. I know that there's not a lot of public subsidy for those middle income units, but there are developers who are being creative in finding subsidies that can help finance those middle income units. and also combine that with LIHTC and some market rate. And I think that is a fantastic way of promoting these ideas and promoting integrated neighborhoods. We, creating public subsidy programs that can subsidize middle income or workforce. We don't like that term, but that's what these programs are often called. We write about a development in Massachusetts. Massachusetts has a workforce housing fund that helps finance these middle income units, and a developer created a development that has a mix of market rate, middle income, and very low income units. All of the units are similar, so when one family's income increases, the next unit that comes up becomes then like a lower income unit if they've went from low to middle income. So all of the units are interchangeable, and so it can maintain a perfect balance. And they have social events, and people get to know each other. And my dad interviewed people who live there and asked if they knew which of their neighborhoods were in which kind of units, and they didn't. And it's a way of just, building up community and social networks and providing a range of housing opportunities that is what is needed in the community. So that's one way. I think advocating for changes to states' qualified action plans around LIHTC to take out the sort of the ways that those QAPs often prevent LIHTC projects from being developed in higher opportunity areas, like requiring community buy-in as to get the points you need to get a tax credit allocation, where these higher income areas, often it's hard to get the community buy-in. Yeah. So that basically prevents us from being able to do it. So there's sort of like a larger advocacy piece too that is necessary. So hope that helps. Yeah, thanks. I think there's some.
Yeah. I have it. I can't figure out how to get it to work. Is it on? No?
Yep.
Oh, okay, great. So my question is about the asset gap that there seems to have a pretty straight line back to subsidy and support for white homeowners that was not afforded to African Americans. And most of the strategies we're talking about don't address that. We're talking more about how to make rental housing more, diverse and remove discriminatory barriers. And I guess I'm a little uncomfortable with land trusts as the primary tool, because land trusts don't allow for that asset. It might give the community more control of property, but it doesn't give the family the same access to wealth building that the white population had. So that doesn't feel to me like a response or a correction of that harm or an addressing of that harm. And you talked a little bit about how down payment assistance programs, which, if they're used where you can get the full appreciation on the home, could get there. But then the Fair Housing Act is often used as a reason that down payment assistance programs can't target black buyers. So I'm just wondering what ideas you have about that particular harm and how to address that harm.
Yeah. Do you want to add to that?
I know that there's a lot of land trusts that have a resale formula, and it's really the resale formula that will determine wealth generation of the house. And most land trusts are more concerned with building sustainable, affordable homes for the future. But that will not help fix the wealth loss in the black community. And so, go ahead.
Yeah, that's a great question. Land trust is one solution of many, and it creates permanently affordable home ownership, and it limits the equity those families can build. So that's why it's not the only solution that we need, and that's why every community should decide, do we want this model? Is it more important to build these permanently affordable homes or to build equity? And that's also why we should have a variety of programs and strategies to address all of the needs. The reason why the equity is limited in land trusts is to allow the next family to have an affordable home price without putting new subsidy in it. So if we don't have an ongoing source of funding to make it affordable every time it's sold, a land trust is a great model for that. And the homeowners in land trusts do earn some equity. They also get the forced savings of paying into a mortgage and often come out of it with enough for a down payment on another home. So it's good, but yes, it doesn't fix the wealth gap that we're talking about. That's why we do need down payment assistance programs. And we, financial institutions, governments can, like Washington is doing, start a special purpose credit program where their down payment assistance can be race-based. We also profile in Just Action a couple of just private citizens. One was a real estate agent, one runs a high-end property management company in DC and decided they wanted to do something about this issue, and they raise money from companies and individuals. We would argue realtors should be putting a percentage of their commissions into these kinds of funds that can then, they then provide down payment assistance grants to African American and Latino home buyers. And those have not been legally challenged. And they are significant grants and allow these families who have the income needed to qualify for the mortgage, but not the intergenerational wealth for the down payment. And then they build up equity. Like, they have no restrictions. They own the home. They got a grant to help pay the down payment. So realtors should be contributing to those. The California Real Estate Association had a special purpose credit program, down payment assistance program. Also, it is, last I checked, out of funding. So another thing that could, the California, all of the real estate associations and agency in the state should be giving a percentage of their commissions into that fund to do that. And I'll add, opening up another can of worms, is that homeownership isn't the only answer to fixing this wealth gap. There's a lot of reasons why homeownership has been a very effective wealth building tool for white families and a less effective wealth building tool for African American families. So when we talk about homeownership as it's not basically the only answer to closing that wealth gap and building wealth, because there's all these other things we have to fix to ensure that homeownership for African Americans is the vehicle for wealth building it is for whites. A couple of examples: addressing appraisal bias to ensure that homes owned by African Americans are appraised at their correct value. Addressing property tax assessment disparities. In every metropolitan area around the country, homes in African American or majority census tracts, those areas, those neighborhoods, pay a higher effective property tax compared to the value of their home than homes in white neighborhoods. And if anyone's interested, I could try to explain why that is. But basically, the property tax assessment system doesn't correctly assess the property values of homes in white areas compared to black areas. So homes in white areas are underassessed, and so they pay a lower tax rate compared to the value of their home. Homes in African American communities are overassessed, so they pay higher tax rate compared to the value of their home. If you're paying more than your fair share of taxes, you can build less wealth. You have less money to save. So we have to fix that. There's disparities in home insurance rates between white neighborhoods and African American neighborhoods. The credit scoring system leads to African Americans having lower credit scores and therefore paying higher interest rates. When you pay a higher interest rate, you can build less wealth through your home ownership experience. So there's a lot of pieces of the puzzle to address. And then there's just the basic bias in our society that homes in African American neighborhoods of the same quality homes in white neighborhoods, holding everything else equal, the quality of the schools, all of the other characteristics of the neighborhoods, homes in African American neighborhoods sell for less than homes in white neighborhoods. And so this is just, I don't have a direct solution to that except to continue to work on policies that address the bias in all of our systems and create neighborhoods that are more integrated, and eventually work on sort of dispelling the bias and discriminatory underpinnings of our society. Yeah, I guess I'll stop there. But those are some thoughts.
Good morning, Leah. Thank you so much for being here. And I run a CDFI, CDC, also in Southeast Seattle. And per part of your last point, we started a specific down payment assistance fund that went from 80 to 120% area median income simply because the gap in cost of housing here in our market is staggering compared to many parts of the country. So we had to create a private fund. It's a combo of a real estate company that I used to work for a couple of lifetimes ago that recognizes their role and that they have to contribute. So we want to grow that fund and use it for DPA. But my prime question is, we're fortunate in the city of Seattle that as a developer, which we are as well, we have the community preference policy where we can take half the units in a development and segment them for residents that have community preference. I used to live here, my family used to live here, I get services here that affect certain, shall we say, neighborhoods or census tracts. So race isn't specifically called out, but it's likely that the community members we're trying to affect are BIPOC and African American largely. My question for you is, have you seen or do you have suggestions how we might spread the gospel of this type of policy approach? Because as far as I know, it's the only community preference policy in the state of Washington, and we'd like to see that be developed in other areas to help solve this problem.
Yeah, that's a great approach. How to spread the gospel. I mean, being in places like this with all of the people who could do it in their respective communities, I would suggest doing that. I mean, I think like anytime there's an example like that of a community doing something, you know, when we don't know about it, we think it's impossible. And so we just have to start talking about these examples and promoting them and lifting them up. So I'm not a social media person, but that way, you know, just starting to get it out there and get it in the conversation, I think is, because these like nuances of housing policy. I live in Oakland. There's also a preference for displaced residents in some of their housing programs, which I had to dig so deep to find in the like literature of this particular housing program. And it's a great aspect of the program. People don't know about it unless they're looking for it or are like, you know, geeking out on that for some reason. So I think all of like everything else we're talking about, we just have to like talk about it more often. And, you know, in these rooms where people are working on it professionally, but also in our neighborhoods and with our neighbors, and make it more a normalized conversation of why it's important that there's a program like that in Seattle, why it would be important in other communities as well. Yeah. Anyone else have ideas? Yeah.
Hello. I run a nonprofit that does affordable housing and a slew of other things in West Seattle, but my passion, affordable housing. And I had asked the question, is there an area in the country that's tackling affordable housing and anti-displacement in a creative way that you think others should pay attention to?
Right, this was the question you asked. I think there's a lot of places.
Can you say it again?
Yeah, is there a place in the country that's tackling affordable housing and anti-displacement in a particularly promising way? There are a lot. I think, you know, there's a lot of examples of jurisdictions doing like one or two things. I don't know that I know of one that's like doing everything because it's such a heavy lift to do anything, so it takes time. I believe, it's in the DC area. I just read about this, so forgive me that I'm not gonna get it all right. But they, which is the county around DC that has a great middle income housing requirement. I'm blanking on it right now. Montgomery County, thank you. I believe that's the county. They also have a publicly funded, basically funder for affordable housing development. So it's a continuously sort of refunded fund that can then provide financing for affordable housing development and at a lower cost than developers would find out in the private market. And in return, they have to build their developments have to be a certain percent affordable at a certain level. So that's a great model. I just read about that recently. I could find it, send it to you if you'd like. So yeah, I have a lot of examples of small things that communities are doing, and I think just because it takes so much, and we're like, I know a lot of us have been working on this for a long time, but it's still, in order to really have a comprehensive approach to where it's all actually been implemented and working for a while, where we can know it is working. I don't know of those examples, but I welcome anybody telling me where I should be looking for more.
Great.
Thank you.
In the spirit of that, I would like to offer to everyone in this room that you have the ability to activate right here in our community. If you were visiting up at the sponsor booths, we have the Black Home Initiative, which is out of the Seattle-King County area. And it is a model that is asking all of these questions and answering all of these questions through its 7-point plan. And we would love to have you as part of that effort. And I really encourage everyone to go upstairs and make sure that they connect with Black Home Initiative today. Also, you should know that as part of the Covenant Act, there is a study that is determining the discrimination and is also taking stories today from our Fair Housing Center of Washington, the National Fair Housing Alliance, and you can connect with that upstairs as well. So I'd really hate if we all left this room and said, gee, these are really complicated things, and who's thinking about it? When there has been a more than 2-year effort here in our state, and we are leading. So if you are looking to join that network, it's right there for you. Just take the escalator up one level, and there are more than enough people who will be able to help you answer that question about the land trust. We got that great question yesterday at the Black Home Initiative Learning Lab. We'd love to talk to you about the community preference policy in King County. We'd love to talk to you about what you can do to become a tester, like you were saying, for the Fair Housing Center of Washington, which is upstairs right now with National Fair Housing Alliance, waiting for you to come in and say, I could be a tester, I can be an ally, I could actually activate. So we absolutely invite you to do that. And these aren't things that people have been going, gee, I wonder what we could do. These are communities who have been waiting for empowerment to do this, and they're not going to get it, they take it. And so be a part of that empowerment, because you are also part of that.
Thank you so much. And there's been a hand up here for a long time. I think now's about the time everybody should turn off their phones before the...
It's 11:20 now. So.
Oh, it's at 11:20. Never mind.
Well, thank you again for the great keynote, and I'm looking forward to both of your books. I have a comment about community land trust, especially in a state like Washington, where we don't have income tax, state income tax. So the treasurer relies on property taxes. Community land trust does not provide property tax. Also, the property value being lowered generates less income property tax from the home itself. In addition to that, financing of homes on community land trust is more difficult. Lenders will not, or maybe at a higher rate, or maybe make more hurdles to jump over for financing and refinancing of homes on community land trust. The question I have is, how can we prevent that racial and other groups are being played against each other? I think it has been historically, not just in the US, worldwide, always been a very easy way for a ruling group to say, well, it was their fault, fight them, and prevent the groups to unite and be a united front. And I think that was that came up during the Black Lives Matter movement. I think it's very important that all minority groups, all groups that are being discriminated against, unite on one front. And I think that way they will win. We will win. We will all win that way.
Mm-hmm. Certainly, we should be united, and I would just add to that we also have to be specific, especially in terms of this discussion around residential segregation, specific about the solutions what we're solving. So there won't be one solution that will address all of the discrimination that all minority groups have suffered, and any solution like that will be hard to create the justification and the momentum behind it. If we can be specific about we very specifically focus on the discrimination and bias and harms that have been suffered by African Americans in this country in terms of housing and segregation, so that we can have specific solutions to those harms. Certainly other groups, other communities of color have suffered other harms and discriminations, and we need specific solutions to those harms as well, but trying to create a solution, a lot of the solutions to the segregation of African Americans will also benefit other communities of color, but if we're not specific about what we're solving for and what we're remedying for, we're less likely to be able to get them enacted and to build the support we need. So we all collectively need to support all of those specific solutions to the specific harms. So I would add that to your comment. And I think we're at time. And one question, and then I have one plug. Yeah, hi.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Morales, and I work as a housing stability specialist with the deaf. Let me back up. Abuse, Deaf Women's Advocate Services, ADLAWS. And before that, I worked for about 11 years working with a different housing official. And I work with deaf-blind people, deaf people, and there are many barriers that domestic violence survivors face with their credit score. And they're challenging, how do we help improve that score in order to provide them with equal opportunities? I'm just curious of your experience that tends to marginalize or block them from being able to afford housing, and it's been kind of tough to figure out what to do. It's not a simple process. And so maybe working with landlords or maybe providing exceptions, and, because their scores are going to be typically lower, like maybe sometimes very low, like in the 400s. And so how do we either get those scores up or create sort of exceptions or any ideas for that system? We've been really locked in our efforts to resolve that issue, especially with families with kids, and they're often very stuck.
Yeah, thank you. Did everybody hear that? Okay. It was a question about credit scores and helping specifically deaf, blind victims of domestic violence who have low credit scores to be able to access housing that they're denied because their credit scores are low. So there are programs to help folks improve their credit scores, and we talk about some of those programs like home buyer assistance programs or counseling and education programs. And again, those programs can be specific for the populations that have specific, very unique issues with those problems. So developing a program to help that specific population improve their credit scores could be something that would help. Also working with landlords, like you mentioned, to put less weight on credit scores. This is something that I know advocates are doing in general, especially to prevent some of the discrimination that Section 8 tenants have when it comes to denying them because of their credit scores, and why that has a disparate impact for all of the reasons that credit scores have a racially disparate outcome. So working with landlords or advocating to have exceptions to using credit scores, I think, is another important piece of it. I think as advocates, creating sort of movements and supporters and stakeholders that include landlords to ensure that piece of the puzzle doesn't keep those particular tenants out of housing. And I hope if anybody else has additional ideas about this specific piece, maybe they can come add to that. And before everybody leaves, I want to thank you all for being here. I wasn't sure if people would want to come ask me more questions, so thank you. And I mentioned we have a Substack column where we're continuing to write about this. Our most recent one was a couple of weeks ago where I wrote about the Washington Covenant Homeownership Act, and it's justaction.substack.com. You can subscribe for free. It just means that it gets delivered to your inbox. We write about every couple weeks. And if you have success stories, particular challenges, interesting ideas, please reach out to me. Always looking for more things to uplift and write about. Also just wanted to put on your radar a national group called the Redress Movement. It was formed out of The Color of Law and the interest in that book. And they're placing organizers around the country to help communities organize around the redress of segregation. It's redressmovement.org. If you go /justaction, you can sign up through, this talk, or just go to Redress Movement. But if you sign up there, /justaction, an organizer will reach out to you if you want to learn more about what other communities are doing or how to get something going in your own community. So I think that's it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Don't forget about her books.